we are discussing today mostly the problems. We will be presenting for you actually project examples, but at the same time also we would like to show you one, let's say, good example from Hungary, where we see actually that even some bad project happened in a Hungarian city, but finally the European Commission decided to suspend the payments, and basically there are consequences of human rights violations in EU funds. So we have a hope, we have an example where actually one we can rely on the future. So other countries, other cities, they should follow actually these examples from the point of view that please don't harm more and don't use actually these human rights violations. We will show, Louise, if you don't mind to show actually the slide. So we would like to show you actually the organizations, and let me make a short presentation of all of them. Yeah, so you see on the slides, which you probably get actually in the invitation as well. So these are the organizations who are working together today, and the representatives of these organizations will speak today. Let me not go into the details of all of these organizations. I would like to invite all the participants, all the speakers to introduce themselves actually and to name the organization, which organization they are representing. But this is really a broad coalition, as you see. And again, colleagues are representing different fields of human rights violations. And that would be the basic aim, what we would like to achieve today, that to see that these colleagues, they can work together and we can represent a joint effort when we are discussing the human rights violations. Please, if you don't mind, please use the second slide. So just very briefly, we want to inform you that this is again a kind of new coalition which consisting of different organizations who are representing different fields of human rights violations. And we would like to work together more in the future. And this is just the first step, what we are doing today. The first step is to come up actually with the project examples, to understand what we do call actually as a violation of human rights, violation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. You will see some details in the presentations actually about this. But we would like to go forward, and we would like to discuss actually what the fundamental rights bodies at the country level they can do. We would like to also talk a little bit actually about policies at the local level, guidances, solutions, so to make some cases that basically it's doable to tackle segregation, to tackle institutionalization, or to tackle actually the deprivation of liberty of some people who are now residing in reception centers. And we are also trying to give some solutions actually about the education and residential segregation, where we see that some capacity improvement would be very much necessary, because there are a couple of questions which are arriving to us, that what to do in small settlements, big settlements, what to do with the segregated schools in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, how to understand better actually the so-called inclusive education and desegregated housing. So without further ado, I would like to ask Louise to start the video of Gerard Quinn. Unfortunately, Gerard, who is a special rapporteur from the UN on the rights of people with disabilities, he is not able to join us today because he has some health issues, but he sent us actually a video. So the keynote speech will be done now actually through this video, what Gerard sent it to us.
Yeah, just to mention, we have started to record the webinar, so just so everyone's aware. If you don't want to be shown, then feel free to turn off your camera. And also we have closed captioning that you can enable as well. Yeah, and let us know if there are any issues with that. Just message me in the chat. Yep. So I'll turn on now the video.
Thank you. This is a very important event today. I very much regret I cannot join you via live stream due to a medical procedure I have to undergo this morning. Today and briefly, I just want to do three things. First of all, allow me to step back from the coalface. There's a world of difference between a myth system, professing a belief in certain core values, and an operation system doing exactly the opposite. We can profess a belief in inclusion, in independent and community living, and yet fund exactly the opposite. Why is there no experience of a contradiction? How do we escape this operation system? Secondly, allow me to say a few words about the core values at play. Often commentators zero in on norms dealing with inclusion, diversity, and community living. I believe that's half the picture. I believe it's important that the other half of the picture is allowed in. And that has to do with the central value of equality and its main legal tool, non-discrimination. Why the tolerance for unequal treatment? Why is equality salient for some groups and not for others? Thirdly, let me try and explain what's at stake for the European Union. We're at a very interesting crossroads. Rights express an implicit understanding of the ordering between the individual and the group, and between individuals and the state. What does the current treatment of some minorities tell us about this implicit ordering in Europe today? Who belongs and who doesn't, and why not? First of all, the difference between a myth system and an operation system. The myth system is obvious. We live in a union of values where rights prevail. The operation system reverts to the nation state where all the important lines are drawn. An important marketplace is the political marketplace. Often at play is a very process-based view of politics. I win, you lose. This market, like all markets, is a sum of competing vectors. It's not intended to solidify, it builds on difference. Interest groups form alliances and wield power and influence through these alliances. That is, if you're lucky enough to be able to form those alliances. This image of democracy envisages an infinite splintering. The public interest is just a pale shadow of competing private interests, or those with enough power to compete in the first place. Rights on their own will not alter this matrix. A much different approach to the public interest, a different understanding of democracy is in fact needed. Secondly, what about the core value of equality? Can it, or how can it, generate a different kind of dialogue? To date, many, if not most, commentators have focused on the right to exercise human agency, autonomy, a right to live your own life, and a right to be included and connected with the community. Nothing wrong with that. It puts forward a very positive philosophy that under the right circumstances, everyone can thrive as a human being. But something is missing. Somehow or other, we have forgotten that this positive right, the right to thrive in one's own community, has a powerful negative analogue. Simply put, unequal treatment meted out by the state, directly or indirectly, that denies us a realistic opportunity to live on our own terms and in our own community is a form of discrimination. Don't take my word for it. By a majority, the US Supreme Court held as much in its famous ruling in the Olmsted judgment of 1999. They held that this was the case under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, discrimination with respect to the provision of public services. The plaintiffs in question were lodged by the state, but in an institution. The court announced a right to a least restrictive environment, which in this case meant outside an institution. What people tend to forget is that pieces of legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act depends on two entirely separate bases of constitutional authority. On the one hand, the Interstate Commerce Clause that allows for minute regulation of any form of commerce with any state impact, interstate impact. And on the other hand, the promise of the 14th Amendment for equality. The promise of equality was only added to the Constitution after 80 years and only after the trauma of the Civil War. Even when it was added, it was mostly ignored by the courts until the 1950s. Bottom line, the question of who belongs and who deserves equal treatment was treated with many mental reservations until the 1950s. The operation system trumped the myth system. What we tend to forget is a somewhat parallel trajectory in Europe. Our prime directive has always been market integration, the internal market, as the equivalent of the US Interstate Commerce Clause. The hope or dream was to create a great commercial republic, that functional integration would lessen the causes of conflict and make for more cooperation. It has succeeded, but it has not supplanted the nation-state ideal forming the basis of the Union. Equality, like in the US, was added only later to EU law in the day. Even then it was added primarily as a mechanism to achieve rationality in the market and mostly on the grounds of nationality to avoid splintering in the market and gender to preserve French law and policy. Nothing inherently wrong with that, except it substantially underplayed the moral, political and legal force of the value of equality. Over time, equality was extrapolated as a fundamental principle of EU law, as a core right and as a foundational pillar for the EU Charter. But it was a process. I recall arguing in the 1990s for a horizontal directorate within DG Employment on equality covering all grounds. I was told that that might debase the currency, that is to say detract from the gender acquis, and so whatever its abstract merits, it was not to be entertained. Announcing a core right of equality beyond gender and nationality was a form of heresy. I thought, how odd. Shouldn't equality be a defining characteristic of the European Union and be for all? I think I stumbled on a core conundrum in EU development. Is it essentially a Europe of the nations, or more correctly, of the nation states? In which case the core question of who belongs and on what terms are to be determined locally and in a self-referencing manner. Of course, it all depends on who the self is, who gets to define it, and how it is actually defined. Parsed a bit more, this means that although you may formally belong, there are invisible lines that determine the extent to which you belong. Access to and participation with social and economic entitlements reflect these implicit gradations. From within this worldview, the equality is not really meant to challenge this. EU funding streams can instrumentalize it and not challenge it. On the other hand, is equality meant to do something else? Is it intended to underpin the idea of Europe as a sort of res publicae that belongs to all? Is it intended to wipe away local particularisms and to emphasize that regardless of difference, we all belong and have equal rights, hopes and expectations? One can easily see the operation system at work. It nearly always reverts to the nation state, which is another way of saying it nearly always reverts to a set of implicit preferences that favour us over them. The myth system of the inherent quality of all does not often tend to be strong enough to overpower the operation system. The defaults seem to be etched very deep. In the 19th century, there was a fierce debate between John Stuart Mill and Lord Acton about the ideal state. Lord Acton took the view that the best state, the most successful state, was one that created space for human difference. Hence the best states were multi-nation states. Mill took the exact opposite view. In his view, the best state is one that congeals around a like-minded, like-interested, homogeneous group. Now, I am with Lord Acton on this, partly because of the moral power of the idea of equality, and partly because it is empirically observable that the more open a society is, the more durable and successful it becomes, and the better able it is to solve its own problems for itself. So what, you might say, what has this got to do with the Charter? My third point is that, like all legal tools, the Charter can be parsed and spun in many different directions. What really matters is the interpretive demeanour of the courts. What really matters is the implicit vision of the society and the place of the individual within that society harboured by the interpreters of the Charter. Notice that the Charter has a creative mix of civil and political rights with economic, social and cultural rights. In fact, economic, social and cultural rights are the majority of the rights in the Charter. This fits with the European tradition of merging a civil rights tradition with key elements of the European social model, a visible contrast with the US. Anchoring these rights, leavening these rights, is the right to equality and non-discrimination. Furthermore, specific groups are called out for amplified treatment under the heading of equality, including cultural and linguistic difference, gender, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. Just a few points. Most of the rights in the Charter are socio-economic rights. By definition, the equality provisions apply to all of them. Since it is through economic and social arrangements that gradations of belonging are determined, then it matters to be able to apply the equality norm across these broad sweep of rights. An example, a few years ago, a Roma housing group complained about housing in Greece to the European Social Charter in Strasbourg. They did have housing units, but these housing units were deliberately placed on top of an old municipal dump. So the substance of the housing right was intact, a right to housing, but the manner in which it was delivered violated the core right of equality and the value of human dignity it was intended to serve. So equality as applied to the full sweep of socio-economic rights and entitlements helps us to interrogate social and other arrangements to detect illicit purposes. The illicit purpose here was to underscore that you don't belong. You're not one of us. Don't get distracted by the normative peculiarities of the different grounds, gender, children, older persons, etc. What really unites them is more important. All belong regardless of difference. All have human agency. All can thrive in community with others. And all benefit, all citizens benefit by having this form of communion. The spirit of Lord Acton, I think, lies behind Chapter 3 of the Charter. Rights do not belong to lawyers. They encapsulate our implicit understandings of human ordering, the right relations between humans. They encapsulate an implicit image of the centrality of the person. They challenge and help us remake arrangements that exclude, either directly or indirectly. The forces that exclude have remained remarkably constant. The default of the nation-state is to prefer us over them, and othering comes with this. But new forces are now cementing this into place. Anxiety about the new economy emerging, anxiety about the durability of the social state, identity-driven nationalist politics that somehow posits a very simple us and them, as if life were so simple. The EU was born of a post-nation-state philosophy, one where market integration rolled back national boundaries. The equality norm of the Charter reminds us that belonging has to do with sharing core values, not with identity. The challenge of making equality real is the challenge of imagining an EU that is open, welcoming and accessible to all. If this means a fundamental rethink of how we apply power to ideas, how we spend EU taxpayers' monies, then so be it. What's at stake is the future of Europe and not the fate of a technical norm in the EU Charter. The stakes could not be higher. I thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing about your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I personally liked very much what Gerard said, simply just a point of view that, again, he made it very clear that separate but equal as a principle, as a methodology, it should not work. So even if you are providing housing rights for one particular group, it doesn't mean that you are really aiming for equal rights. But we will come back to these questions because some of the examples, they are showing exactly the same problems, what Gerard mentioned actually about Greece. So without further ado, I would like to invite Lefteris from the Greek Council of Refugees to explain us actually the Greek example about the deprivation of liberty of people with migrant background. Lefteris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Andor. My name is Lefteris Papagiannakis. I'm the director of the Greek Council for Refugees. And what you see in the picture is a closed control center, which is a very nice way to call a closed center. This particular one is in Samos. It's one of the new funded by the EU closed centers that the previous government has brought as an integral part of its migration management policy since 2019. We have written a report on this particular, this specific center, where we call it basically a prison, because it is a center that basically impedes on the capacity of people to move freely, whatever the legal status of them, and they use a number of excuses in order to keep people in. We've won a case against the management of the camp when they tried to keep someone in because his documents were not appropriate, etc. It's too much technical and legal details, and I don't want to bore you with it. Many of the things that we have done are on our site, and you can look them up. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. The approach of the closed control center is presented by the government as something that benefits all involved, meaning host society, but also migrants and refugees, because it is part of it's part of the management for their security and the security of the host community. It allows them to live in appropriate conditions, and they bring always in this type of discussion the example of Moria, of course, Moria or Idomeni. Of course, when we compare this camp to Moria and Idomeni, yes, you can find positive aspects. You have containers of housing, you have probably, as you can see, hot water, you have electricity. Technically or theoretically, you have running water, but we know that in many cases and for many days, even now, there is no running water, especially now when the flows, as you know, most of you have increased, and the Samos center is over capacity. It was built for 2,000 people, and it hosts now 4,000. So the government has opened up also the detention center that is integrated in the center, because it's a multi-purpose center, as I call them. Of course, the conditions are not appropriate, and we took out a press statement denouncing the conditions of reception. All of this approach, because the points of the previous speaker were very interested, and also Andor mentioned it, all this approach is part of the deterrence policy applied by the Greek government, but also by the EU. Deterrence means that you create bad conditions in order to send a message across and say, don't come in, things are not going to be good for you, it's going to be difficult. Yes, you will have the minimum requirements, but after that, the situation will become much more complicated. The government has defended the operation of these closed control centers, as they call them, because closed centers are not funded by the EU, just to point out. So closed control was a very nice way to bypass this obstacle in the funding process. They actually started by calling them closed, and someone told them that closed centers from the commission told them that closed centers are not funded, so they just added the word. They called them closed controlled access centers, and then they got the funding they needed. Actually, in the last days, we have a number of decisions, basically putting a very, putting a stop to this, to the way that these centers operate. We had interim measures, Rule 39 in the European Court, about the conditions of reception of a mother with a baby because they were not acceptable. Other colleagues with other complaints have also won cases against the operation of these centers and the management of these centers, basically in the principle of operation of these centers. You can see that there are a number of complaints, and there are some colleagues that have submitted complaints that are saying highest, and the ombudsman also started, the ombudswoman basically started a process to look into the violation of fundamental rights, and this is basically what we are discussing. The operation, the sheer operation of these centers violates human rights and fundamental rights of the union. Yes, the effort is to guard the borders by, in the same time, respecting fundamental rights. It's something that Eva Johansson, Margaritis Kinas, and the Commission as a whole is repeating in every possible way, that it is doable to do both things. There is no easy answer to that, I can tell you that. But we are sure that fundamental rights are violated. If you add to that violations that happen before accessing the centers, pushbacks, etc., then you have a system that is based on the violation of fundamental rights. The closed control centers are just, if I can use this word, and just to point out the importance, it's just the symbol of this whole policy. They're shiny and new, but the way they operate and the way that they are used by the government is exactly that, to send a message that, you're not welcome, basically. There is no written statement on that, but the practices implemented in the closed control centers and in the border management procedures are saying this exact story. So the closed control centers are part of this unacceptable management system of migration. Again, I know the arguments on what to do now and how to do it. Are there any solutions to manage migration? What when you do? There are no easy answers when we are talking about migration management. You know that most of you have been dealing with this for a number of years. I don't want to bring any easy arguments. There aren't any, but surely the way that these centers are operating are not appropriate. So we are trying to put pressure on the government to change, and on the EU, of course, to change the way these centers operate, to change the way they integrate into the reception system. If you look on what is missing, the integration policy, the national integration policy is not there. Access to asylum is very difficult sometimes. The excuse of the big flows that do not allow us to be efficient, etc. You always have something that is brought up in order to impede on the application of fundamental rights from migrants and refugees. It is a very long story. We can talk about this for a long time. Yes, you see the things that I said. They're shiny and new, but basically a prison. And there are also big issues with the creation of this closed control centers, because some of them didn't get the permit finally, or they operate in a semi-legal way, etc. So there are a lot of issues that are there. And of course, they're far away from the urban environment, because that's the target, to keep people out and to segregate them. Basically, it's if you want, maybe I exaggerate, but it's kind of into the process of creating a ghetto. It's something very specific that is there for a specific reason. You don't need to care about this thing. It's far away. You don't see it. So as long as you don't see it, you don't need to care about it. And this is what the NGOs are. The NGOs' role is to bring into the public sphere and the public domain the realities of the operation of these centers. I will stop here.
Thank you very much.
Later on, and I will. And when we come to the what can we do about it, we will have some specific proposals on what we can do.
Oh, thank you very much, Lefteris. That was absolutely great. It was very short, clear, and really to the point presentation. I think it's very, very clear actually what we are talking about. Just to be sure that everybody is aware of that, in the first slide or the second slide, sorry, Luis, do you mind actually to tell us actually how much money was allocated actually to these centers altogether from the Commission?
250 million.
250 million. Okay. So just to be sure that everybody is aware actually about the volume of the funding, what we are talking about, right?
Yes, but just a small point on the financial aspect.
Sure.
If you calculate the money spent on this center and the cost, the operational cost, let me give you a very quick number. 1.5 million euros for Samos for 2 months, I think, 1.5 months, to keep it clean and to pay for security.
Here we go. Yeah. Thank you very much.
To a private company.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant. Okay. If I'm not mistaken, Adam is the next one, right? Adam, please, the floor is yours. So as we discussed with all speakers, we are now just giving you a very, very short time, 5 to 7 minutes to talk. And unfortunately, I have to cut you if you are going beyond. But then, when we will have the discussion, then you can come back actually to some details, and people they will have the opportunity to ask questions. Adam, please also introduce yourself. Actually, which organization you are representing.
Yes. Do you hear me well, and do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Adam Zawisny. I'm from the Association Institute for Independent Living in Poland, that is Instytut Niezależnego Życia, and we are a cross-disability advocacy organization, a small organization that tackles with issues of independent living and also deinstitutionalization. My presentation is quite a long one, so I will only focus on the parts that will be, I would say, the most visual. I'll leave the rest as a possibility to download it afterwards so that you can see all of the context. We don't have time to say all of the context of the example of Poland, of disability rights, of the Polish, so-called Polish ESF guidelines, but just to give you a quick overview, the CRPD set a number of recommendations that said of a critical stagnation of a deinstitutionalization process, spending of funds for institutions, the lack of monitoring of these funds, and I would say that we've made a number of elements that are lacking in this regard, also audits, the problems from the partnership agreement up to the audits and independent monitoring of project implementation that made this situation possible. So, and just to say, up to 2018, it was possible even to finance 12 people in a single supported flat, 12 people who do not know each other in a single supported flat. Up from 2018 up to now, it's up to 7 people in a single supported flat. It's possible, just to say, to make up to 7 such flats in a single building. So 49 people in a single building, an unlimited number of buildings in the same vicinity, on the same premise, and in the near vicinity. So basically, you can make an institution into a so-called community-based place. And these are the examples of how such things were made in the 2014-2020 period, but also other ways of misusage or circumventing the community-based principles and the ones that are in the Article 21 of the Charter. So, for example, we have the multi-group building. This one is from Świdnica, Dolne Śląskie. You have a 4-story building. There are 20 flats for 30 people with disabilities, homeless, lone mothers with children, children from orphanages. That's 700,000 euros project, which gained funding in 2018. It's up to now, it's been funded and it stays. So unfortunately, you have basically a ghetto of I would say, discriminatory purpose in one place just to keep the people out, unfortunately. Then you have other examples like institutionalized flats. These is a place, an example and a photograph of one of the rooms with 5 beds, which are basically hospital beds in one room, which is now even impossible in nowadays in social care homes, but it was possible to be used by EU funds in the Pomorskie part, and it was in Słupsk, and it was institutionalized supported flat. So it was 9-person flat with 5-person room and a 4-person room, and it gained 200,000 euro funding to make such a place. It was deemed as quite a short stay, but it was never formally meant that way, and it didn't function that way. Another one of the versions, some of you may know this is a very bad example. I think one of the worst that we've seen is the Home Sweet Home, Wyjątkowy Dom from Łódź Voivodeship. It's an example of an innovative institution. So basically it was a former school which got funded, and it's a 4-story building, and the history is quite remarkable because it was funded as a innovative care home, and it was funded as a way of deinstitutionalize, but in the same time making an institutional place. So it was meant for 30 people on one floor of a 4-story building, but in reality, it was 100 people on 3 floors with 4-person rooms. There were and there are some plans to change that to 60 people and smaller rooms. It's still about more than 1.5 million euros ERDF funding. In total, there are also other public funds there, but the project status is unknown. The final date of ending all works is the end of 2023. So basically, it's may just be that this will really be, I would say, reintegrated, rebuilt, and there will have a new institution in Łódź. So another one is Drzewica. That's the example of expanding of an institution, also in Łódzkie. And basically, you have a building of another places within those institutions, another, I would say, wings of the place. It's an 80-person social care home. It was expanded to be bigger, and that's rebuilding and renovation. That's 2 million euros from EU funds. And the indicators are quite specific because it said that's a number of built, rebuilt, and renovated facilities with social services. That's 1. Number of aided institutions for dependent persons. That's 1. So the indicators are absolutely not in line with any of the parts of the Charter or the CRPD in that regard, but still the indicators were made as, as finance, and it's in this regard, it's deemed a success. Another one, Kozula Lubelskie, that's modernizing of an institution. You see on the photograph, a big one, and it's a 220 people social care house, quite away from the municipality of Biała Podlaska, modernized, financed by ERDF funds. That's over 350,000 euro project, and all the indicators are a number of rebuilded facilities where there is social vocational activization, and 220 people which are the beneficiaries of that, and it got funded in 2018, and it's been successfully made as a modernizing basically of the institution under the guise of community-based services. Another one, Tomczyce Mazowieckie, that's energy efficiency modernization. You see on the photographs a really big institution. It's 90-person social care house with 2- and 3-person rooms away from bigger municipalities. That's more than 280,000 euros from EU funds. And again, this is one of the examples of a place where people died during COVID, also in Tomczyce, but before also in Drzewica. So this is the question of whether EU funds really funded security in this regard, or rather insecurity and the higher possibility of lack of health or death. And also one of the last examples of big scale psychiatric hospital. This is the example of Drewnica Mazowieckie. The picture shows a big institution, a very big one. This is newly built, completely from scratch. You can see that discrepancy between the place and the sum of the neighborhood is really big. It has a very institutional feel inside and outside and both inside. And it's a 300-bed hospital, very far away from the area that in theory it should support. It should be for the Wołomiński Powiat, but basically it's nearly a 40-50 minute drive by car to get to this so-called community-based service center, because it's said as a community-based service center. And this is 23 million euros from the ERDF in 2017. And one of the last examples is a private nursing and rehabilitation facility. It's called Sunny Hill. Most of these have absolutely great, teams. A senior home in Łódzkie, and I'll show you a couple of examples of photographs from Google View that show what is the vicinity of this place. It's a 30 people nursing home plus 30 places for social care support. And this is the place. It's a very rural place. And you can see each of the examples, the photographs show that it's basically inside of a hugely rural area. So this is the biggest place there is in the whole vicinity, in the near 10 kilometers. And you can even see that it's in nearly 30 kilometers to the distance to the nearest Powiat office, the nearest municipality, which is Tomaszów Mazowieckie. There is no public transportation operation to there, and it's still 30-40 minutes drive to get there. And it was financed in 2017. It's with 100,000 euros from EU funds, and it's also a private place. So basically, it's a 30-person place plus nursing plus daycare. So basically, it's funding of private nursing institutional settings. So
Adam, I should stop you now.
Yes, and I think that's the end of the examples. And just to show you, there is a number of things that could be done to make it sure that we don't have this situation. And thank you very much. These are some of the examples. Of course, I have to say we have also better examples from Poland, but unfortunately, there is a very, very big discrepancy of the examples that are not according to the charter and not according to the CRPD. We hope that this will change in the current period. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Really brilliant. Actually, these pictures and the whole setup was really very clear. Thank you very much. We will come back to these examples and the whole, let's say, context actually in the discussions, because there are obviously lots of things. As I would say that, as we have seen earlier, of course, that the Polish government would say that it's absolutely in line with the regulations. And even actually some commission or European institution people would say that it's absolutely in line actually with the human rights regulations. But we should go back to this. So we covered now actually the refugee rights questions in Greece. Now we were talking a little bit actually about the disability rights in Poland. Now we move to the Roma issues. So first, Florin from Romania, maybe you can join us, Florin, and you can show us actually the examples from Romania, especially about the housing questions, segregated housing questions. Florin?
Hi, hello, my name is Florin Botonogu, working for Policy Center for Roma and Minorities. And I'm, because we only have 5 minutes, and I only have one example, I just start with the conclusion. And basically I'll resume it like this. We have some money, because when it comes to housing for Roma, a big problem is money. Now we might have some money, from the European Union, some funds, We also might have some regulation, because EU, of course, they have regulations, and they say it's not okay to do segregation. But the problem is that we don't have anyone checking what's really going on in the field. So today we are just going to talk about this big initiative that is not only in Romania, it's called CLLD, Community-Led Local Development, where basically the scheme is that municipality private sector and deprived communities get together, they make a plan for development for, let's say, 7 years, and they get some money for it. So it's very good because it's integrated approach. You have ESF type of investment, ERDF type of investments, and of course it's one chance that the municipality took to build housing for Roma because we don't really have some money. And in parentheses, it took like 10 years for the Romanian government to build 300 houses for Roma, just to get an idea about what's happening with housing in Romania. Okay, so now we have the money, we have the correct framework, yeah, because of course together with the money comes some guidance. Say you are not going to do segregation and you are not allowed to reinforce segregation. Okay, so we have in this program 33 urban localities, local action groups, and every program received like 7 million euros, and approximately half of it you could use it for ERDF type of investment, whether it's housing, roads, repairing, whatever type of investments. Okay, local development strategies were developed, yeah, and it was supposed to be in strict cooperation with the Roma themselves. As a condition, of course, CLLD should prevent and decrease residential and educational segregations. And of course, together with Andor and Luis, we saw like 3 projects in Romania where we saw segregation. The only notice here is that due to purely administrative reasons, the works are far behind. So we don't know if the housing will be finished, yeah, but the works are far behind. New strategies are under development. Again, we have the framework against segregation, but God knows what will happen in the field. So just briefly, we go to the picture. This is from the presentation, from a presentation in Shepsi, and they say you can see here in the yellow stripes, you see basically it's part of the existing ghetto. So the technical term, I think it would be like reinforcing segregation in this case, because they tear down some houses, they relocate people in the city, they say, but then when you go to the details, they relocate indeed in the city, but in other Roma communities. So it's not like real integration. And here in the middle, of course, at the margins of the locality and next to the forest, they decided to rebuild these houses. Maybe we can go further. And this is an example of segregated kindergarten in Sfântu Gheorghe. This was in August. Why do we say segregate? Yeah, and this is where they should start to build the housing. You can see it's very close to the already existing community. But going back to the kindergarten, it's a kindergarten. Why do we say segregated? Because it's clearly only for Roma living here, because no farther than 500 meters the municipality is building another kindergarten, which is clearly for the majority population. And all this is going without any checks. What is just to mention, in terms of educational segregation, we do have some national orders, minister orders, and some regulation. In terms of housing in Romania, we don't have any type of regulation. But in terms of educational segregation, we do have this kind of regulations. So just to end up, even if we have the money, if of course, I'm not talking about the charter. The charter is clear. The regulation is clear. We have the money. We have the guidance from the commission. We have the guidance from the management authority to the local authorities that they should implement and build non-segregated settlements. And although we have all of this, nothing is happening for the better. Why? Because nobody is checking what's really going on in the field. I mean, we are at the end of the program. The program will end in 2 months, and we have this segregated building. What do we do now? That's the question. So I will just end here and wait for questions. And
thank you very much, Florin. That was again brilliant, short and very, very clear. Participants, you will have opportunity to ask questions from the speakers actually at the end of this session as well. And I can imagine that it's a very dense and complex information what we are sharing with you now. But don't worry, that was the whole point. So we wanted to give you actually the a bit of snapshot actually what's happening in this project, and then we can go furthermore actually with the details at the later stage. We just wanted to, let's say, provocate a bit of discussions that's what's happening in the field. And then, as Florin said, we are doing some field visits, so it's not just, these informations are not just coming from the air. We have seen it actually with our own eyes a couple of months ago. Lenka, this is your turn. We are still in the Roma business, and now an example from Czechia. Lenka, we don't hear you.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone.
Good.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and present one example. I'm from the NGO Fundamenta, and we pursue the rights of Roma children to quality mainstream education via 3 programs. One is a research, the other one is community organizing, or organizing Roma parents with regard to equal access of Roma children to quality primary education, and through advocacy on local, national, and international level. And I would like to say that in the Czech Republic, so we basically deal mainly with in the field of education. And in the Czech Republic, we have 4,200 primary schools, and 262 are segregated schools where we have more than 30% of Roma children. And this is just one example out of the total amount of schools, how actually segregation is being supported, maybe not intentionally, of course not intentionally, through the usage of EU funds. One school is, as you can see from the picture, is 100% Roma school, which has been located in Prague 3. This is just a little show of this area of Prague 3. Used to be 12 years ago a Roma, it has been populated mainly by Roma. But in the past 10 years, Roma have been moved to another part of Prague. Prague has 22, actually 57 municipal parts, and Roma currently live mainly in 3 municipal parts, even though they are being dispersed, but they live mainly there. And this school has been existing for the past 60 years, and it's been always a Roma school. Unfortunately, children, when they finish the school, they don't continue to secondary education, and if they tend to drop out. And the research shows that the main reason is because they don't have enough knowledge to catch up with their peers in secondary education, even if it's only a vocational training school. So I'm not even talking about the secondary higher education, from which they are able to continue to universities. So most of the children then don't continue to education. And if I can please, yeah, thank you. This school, these are just some examples of projects from 2021 and 2022. These projects have been existing since a long time, but this is just a few examples of the EU-funded projects. For example, it has 73,682 euros has been spent on this school, where for tutoring children, you know, these digital technologies, they were meant to set the inequalities caused by COVID, by the pandemic. Then another project was to support further education of pedagogues how to work with heterogeneous group. However, this school is 100% Roma children. Even despite all of these projects, they are not continuing to secondary education, and the quality of education provided in this school is very low. So basically, not only there is a segregated school, but really the quality of education is very low. And I must say that basically in the Czech Republic, as my colleague Florian was mentioning, we don't have a monitoring bodies, which would monitor actually how the money is being used, what is its impact, and how effective or ineffective it is. And in the call proposals, there are no conditions for segregation, which would say actually, okay, the proposal states this, but you have to mind not to create segregation, or to avoid segregation. No conditions, no terms whatsoever in the call proposals. So this is just one example of, as I said, 262 schools which are segregated.
Thank you very much, Lenka. From my side, obviously, there are some questions, and I should not abuse this situation, but we will come back to this to some questions because it's very, very clear that in your case, or in the case of Florin from Romania, there's something wrong with the system. So maybe we should come back to the question, as we already actually said it in the agenda, that how much is it a kind of sporadic action, or how much there is a systemic discrimination when the Czech state or the Romanian state is, let's say, using the EU funds, how much they are taking care actually about the systemic discrimination in general. Colleagues, participants, if you have some immediate questions, now you have the opportunity to ask the presenters. I see one question or one hand raised. Mila, please go ahead.
Yes. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, perfect.
We hear you. We hear you very well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will not abuse the time given for this intervention. I just wanted to start by introducing myself. With some of you probably I have met. I'm the Anti-Racial Discrimination Advisor for Europe with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This was very recently created post for 5 regions in the world. So I recently moved from Latin America here. Part of my agenda includes people of African descent, Roma, migrants, all population groups that we can consider as being discriminated by ethnic or racial characteristics. This said, I would really invite you very much to share, if possible, with me the presentations, and/or through you, I will reach out to the network also to present a little bit in more detail the work that I'm doing. I just wanted to advance that we have been doing also quite some analysis on anti-racism and non-discrimination policy in the EU. And indeed, and I come from statistical background, one of the major considerations is, in fact, the lack of monitoring, evaluation, and indicator systems at the stage of development of projects and then during the implementation, which is something that is part of my mandate in Europe. So I would be really glad to have opportunity to collaborate with you. Now, since I'm rather new in the region, less than 6 years, and coming back to Europe after many years outside, I just wanted to touch a couple of questions with you, with all the participants, because you mentioned it and some of the things are really striking. Just to understand correctly, at the stage of application for EU funds, there is no system established to detect potential practices of segregation that are going to be incurred to during the implementation. And if this is the case, would you be willing probably to exchange and collaborate with us on possibilities to build upon international standards? big problem in Europe, European Union is, you know it, that there is almost no reference to international, by the way, normatively binding framework. No? So anti-racism and trauma framework programs, none of these policy instruments are binding by nature, while international standards are. So we can probably ideate a way of moving ourselves along the international recommendations. A very long way, but not impossible. So this is one. The other one is, to what would you attribute the complete lack in the public discussion at EU level and then at country level on one part of the, of this chain, which is all the population that either perpetuates discriminatory and exclusion practices, and the part of the population with whose biases, prejudices, and stigma one has to work. At policy level here, I'm surprised that very little, if no attention is given to this component, and if you would consider also touching upon this issue, no? The grade not attended by policy. Thank you so much for the long time that you gave me.
Thank you very much, Mila. Thank you. Florin, I see your hand. Maybe we can continue with you.
Yes. So just to answer the first question, in the case of community-led local development, what I've been telling you is that they make this kind of strategy, local strategy. One thing is that this strategy is not relating to the other development strategies that are at local level. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. But more because you ask this, in this strategy, you are supposed to exactly elaborate how you are not going to segregate, okay, or how you are contributing with this to desegregation. So the problem is that they wrote this in the strategy. The ones who evaluated the strategies and the programs approved it, and then nobody knows what's happening in the field. Yeah, just to give you a stupid example, somebody wrote in the strategy that in order to desegregate, they are going to pave the roads inside the Roma communities. And this is their strategy for desegregation. So we are at this level at this moment.
Yeah.
Okay. No, the lack of monitoring evaluation after this, it's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Florin.
Yeah, I think, Mila, we can go back to this question actually with some more details in the discussion, because Florin also mentioned it, that the Commission published guidance for the 14-20 period, and also now we made it published actually for the 21-27 period about how to tackle segregation of Roma. But as Florin said, the implementation is very, very low quality, if I can make this judgment just in this very informal way. But it's better if Lenka will speak. Lenka, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to mention that in the Czech Republic, or with regard to project proposals and when schools or anybody applies for, in the Czech Republic, we collecting desegregated data or collecting data about ethnicity is not embodied in the law, right? So if schools or any institution applies for EU-funded projects, nobody knows officially whether it's a Roma school or not. It's been only recently, since the Education Act Amendment 2016, when the Czech Republic, when the Czech officials, the Czech government started slowly, to identify and actually collect data about segregated schools. So it's been only a few years that this data has been collected, right? So if you really want to see the impact, or even if you call the school principals and ask them how many Roma children do you have, we don't know. We don't collect this data, right?
Yeah, Mila, if I understand well your questions, you were also talking actually about public debate, right? So how much, let's say, these questions are tackled in the public? So the Roma segregation, actually, what Lefteris mentioned actually about these closed facilities for migrants, and also about the institutions. Lefteris, what do you think about that? How much this is part of the public debate in Greece?
Unfortunately, I would say none of it. I mean, people are not interested in what is happening in a closed center that is in the middle of nowhere, very far from the city. They cared and they discussed and they had valid questions when camps were near the cities, and they had concerns, and this is understandable. But we have, we have to discuss with them and present the arguments of the benefits of integration, etc., etc. But when there is no policy and the narrative is completely hostile and toxic, then you need to prove why you choose the center of the city and not a very far, a place that is very far from the city. Now the government, this one, which is, choosing this approach, is talking about camps that are very far. There is no commute. They're closed, basically, and they will do integration in the camps, which is a complete violation of all the rules of the EU. Because if you look at the strategy of integration 21-27, it clearly states, and I'm trying to use, a verbatim, the verbatim wording, integration happens where migrants live, work, have a hobby, etc., etc. I don't remember the exact wording, but this is the principle. This is the theory behind the integration process. Greece is choosing to do integration in camps. How? There is no integration in camps because it's not integration. It is clear segregation. It's ghetto, creating ghettos, keeping people far. As long as you cannot see, you won't mind. There is a saying in Greece: eyes that do not look at each other are easily forgotten, etc. It's a long mantra, but this is the approach. If you don't see it, it's not your problem. Let me take care of it for you. Don't discuss about it. It's not your issue. We are going to take care of everything. It's a very paternalistic state, as you know, Greece, and it's the government is going to solve all of your problems. When there is a crisis, for example, COVID, or the increase of flows, or some crisis with Turkey, migrants are always used as a danger. Right? Danger to public health, danger to public safety, danger to national security. You've seen it with the creation of the portfolio of Margarita Sinas, our European way of life. You see it with the department created in the structure of the Prime Minister's office. There is a department called National Security, National Defense, Citizens Protection, and Migration. When you put these three things together, you create a narrative. People feel that migrants are a danger. They are invaders, they are enemies, etc. Hybrid war, the notion of hybrid war, was invented in Greece. March 2020, the border of Evros. It was used in the border of Poland and Belarus. It is a hybrid war. We are fighting against a common enemy, etc., etc. This is the narrative. So people do not discuss about these things. The government gives the lead and they follow.
Thank you very much. I have a question. I just want to reflect on this because and we will come back to this, of course, in more details in the facilitated discussion. But what is more important question that we need, let's say, policy guidance, as colleagues mentioned, actually from the Commission, from national governments, or even if you have the policy guidance, the political climate is so much hostile that regardless what policy guidance you are doing, unfortunately, it will not be implemented. What do you think about Lefteris? And Adam, please join to the discussion as well from the Polish point of view.
I think, we don't have many solutions. I mean, when the Commission is asked, they always use the argument of we are not interfering in national politics and we cannot give guidance, politically speaking, to the member states that are independent. Migration policy is a national policy, etc., etc. This is the line of defense of the Commission. But they have leverage, and they proved it many times. They have the leverage. They could leverage money. They punished Greece by not giving money for buying some vessels for the Coast Guard because we didn't have the border monitoring mechanism. Finally, we have some type of monitoring mechanism, and we got the money. They did the same thing with the LGBTQI plus free zone in Poland. They're trying to do it with Hungary. I mean, they have a leverage. They should use it more if they want to change the national policy and the national approach. Then they should implement the rules that they ask from member states to implement. For example, consultation with NGOs. I can tell you that in Greece, consultation is a joke, a complete joke. They invite 2 or 3 NGOs that they know, where they're friendly to the government. All the NGOs that have a more conservative approach, which is fair, I'm not talking about them. They use them in the consultation process and represent this process as consultation and say, I did my consultation, due diligence, etc. It's fine. The Commission should be more vigilant and more, more aware of the type of consultation that the member states choose to do, a more quality-based approach. Which NGOs do you invite? What is the process? The percentage of recommendations that you use from NGOs into your policy, because giving proposals to the government and the government saying no to everything is not a consultation. So there is no positive approach. For example, in Greece, the vice minister for migration, who is leading integration, considers NGOs enemies, and then goes on national TV and says NGOs are our partners. When we are treated as enemies and then used as partners, it's a bit, confusing.
Adam and Mariam, I also see your hand, but Adam, can you just reflect on this question briefly from the Polish point of view?
Yes, I strongly agree with Lefteris on this regard that there is surely a possibility to have guidance on how to implement the specific elements. We have those, of course, in the DI guidelines of the UN. The UN recommendations to specific countries also have this, I would say, the need of this monitoring and a very clear guidance. And I would say that if there is not enough guidance from the EC, then the countries made their own guidelines, which are very clearly against the ones that are on the CRPD and the Charter, I would say, fundamentals. So like only in this regard, well, Poland has a lot of good things happening, but unfortunately in EU funds, there is also a lot of things that are bad happening. And one of these are those so-called ESF guidelines, which make it possible to make 49 people, buildings, and even to transform institutions into buildings, like into supported flats. And I would say that it goes even further, because the countries themselves ask the European Commission, what is your stance on this? One of the questions that was raised just like a couple of weeks ago from Poland was that, can you make places like if you make respite care, Poland wants to make sure that you cannot make respite care in private flats, only in institutions, so that you can make respite care only in institutions. Why? Because people don't want on their own will to go to the institutions or have respite care there. So let's take out all of the other possibilities so that it's the only one. So it's absolutely, like it's outrageous, but it's happening. So if there's not enough guidance, then we have those situations. So if there is no guidance, then we have those situations of discrimination, which are, I would say, very clear.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. Marian, do you mind actually to step in, Paraskeva, and just
yes. Yeah. So I worked for many years in the Commission, and in all these areas of non-discrimination and with the funds. And I have to say, guidance, there is plenty. There is plenty of guidance. The thing is that nobody monitors, as it was said, what is happening, and also why the officials fight for respecting the guidance. When it comes to the political level, higher up, it is never done. And the best example is the RRF investments, where we were consulted, we as officials, on the plans. I personally blocked an investment on a camp for Roma in containers in Greece. I don't know if this is still blocked or it was unblocked. But, the thing is that what matters for the EU is how much money is spent and how easily the money is spent. And this also counts at national and regional level. And my experience is that for them, the indicator of success is exactly, we've spent so much money, we don't care how this money was spent. And we saw also with the RRF in many countries where there were no institutions, new institutions were built because the hierarchy considered this is a good way to spend the money in 2 years to my time. And if we continue like this, nothing will change. And unfortunately, I left the commission 1.5 years ago, and I cannot recognize what is now happening. We managed to have 10 years, let's say, more or less, of success stories to some extent, again, because we saw in many countries that children were taken out from institutions, but older people came in. But then you see, even in policy initiatives, like the child guarantee or the the care strategy of the Commission, you still have the concept that it's for the best interest of those concerned to go into institutional care. So if you see this line at policy level as well, you are still, starting to reflect on what's going on.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Marian. If you don't mind, we will go ahead actually with the agenda. I don't know if there is still you want to say something.
Very small point.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Very telling example, which is a very unfortunate one. Money that went from the European Commission to the train in Greece. You know that this year we had 59 dead people because the train derailed, etc., crashed into another. And the Commission suddenly decided to look into where the money went. And the result of this research is devastating for both the Greek authorities, the Greek government, but also the Commission. Someone got rich from this funding. No one ever monitored. No one ever requested, some type of evaluation. And now all of the institutions that are involved tragically found out that the money went to the wrong or nowhere to be found. So monitoring is very, very important. It's a very tedious job, but someone has to do it, especially the Commission who is giving out the money.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the discussions. Now, let's turn to human rights organizations and lawyers, Ines and Stephen, and maybe they can share with us actually their experiences. And they were tackling or fighting against these discriminations for years, and probably they would share with us actually some experiences, some lessons learned actually from these cases. Stephen, Ines, the floor is yours. I don't know who will start.
I will start.
Great. And the presentation is coming.
Is Louise going to share that? Okay, perfect. Well, hi, everyone. Very good to be here, and it's really interesting to listen to what was shared so far. My name is Ines Bulic-Kojokari. I'm coming from the European Network on Independent Living. And like Anders said, with Stephen, we are going to talk about a case we took against the Commission because of their failure to stop funding going into institutions for disabled people. But first, I'm going to give a little bit of background, and Stephen is going to talk about the legal side of it. He's going to talk about the case. I'm going to start by talking about the actions that preceded the case. So for many years now, we have been receiving reports from, I should have said, we are a cross-disability user-led European network. So we have members in 40-something countries. Having said that, we are also a small organization, and most of our members are also grassroots organizations. But for many years, we have been receiving reports now from our members about EU funding going into institutions for disabled people, institutions, but also sheltered workshops, daycare centers, so, psychiatric facilities. So all of these places that we, of course, consider and that are institutional. And so we have been taking a number of actions. Important was, of course, to collect this information, to report it. So we have, been publishing a number of small briefings over the years, and we have been calling for, again, now for quite a few years, for many years, for a better monitoring and complaint system at the European level, precisely because of the reasons we just discussed. that there is no proper monitoring of where the funds are going. As colleagues here said, also there is a big issue with organizations, NGOs on the ground being able to monitor this funding. So we have been working, as much as we could, of course, on capacity building of our members and trying to encourage them to look where the funds are going. But I mean, it's getting actually more and more difficult. As Marianne mentioned, we have new funding like this recovery and resilience facility. So with more funding instruments, it's even more difficult to follow where the money is going. We have made a number of complaints to the European Commission in together with our members like Adam here and Stephen's organization's Validity. So we have made complaints in about 10 or so countries to the Commission, first starting with just sending emails and contacting the units, the responsible units, but then also using this newish complaint system based on the charter, which, I mean, maybe somebody, Luis, or I can share a link in the chat. So it's the system that was established by the Commission some years ago, where you can more easily just fill out a form and make a complaint for violations of EU Charter, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We have also made a complaint to the European Ombudsman, and like colleagues in Greece also, she had 2 own initiative inquiries, which we have contributed to. We have been engaging quite a bit with the European Parliament, so they have been with MEPs who were with us on this issue. They have been making both oral and written questions about funds going into institutions to the European Commission. The Parliament has funded one of our studies, Lost in Interpretation, but also other studies in the use and misuse of EU funds. And we've also had a petition to the Petitions Committee in Bulgaria. I mean, this was all around 2020 and the years before. And we've been working with the CRPD committee, submitting shadow reports, complaints, the UN Special Rapporteur, all, relating to funds going into institutions for disabled people. Unfortunately, the success has been very limited, I'd say. And it's a little bit depressing. I mean, in a depressing way, it's good to hear. I mean, we are not the only ones struggling with all of this, but it has been difficult to achieve much progress. I'll just say, Luis, you can go to the next slide, because Andor thought it'd be good to share a little bit about the complaint system. Which this complaint system that the Commission established, which we've used quite a lot, but it has quite a few limitations. First of all, when it comes to disabled people, even though we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and all the regulations, there is no absolute prohibition, or the Commission believes there's no absolute prohibition of investing in institutions. So we were talking about guidance here. I mean, the guidance that exists at the moment when it comes to disabled people, we have this internal guidance, which actually is goes against the CRPD, goes against the Disability Rights Convention. And so not any guidance, is good guidance. And it's very contradictory because, some documents like the Disability Rights Strategy say that, the whole purpose of the Commission is to respect the CRPD, the Disability Rights Convention. Yet in other documents, they find that investing in institutions is okay under the convention. So it's bad. So that's the second limit of this complaint system, is that the European Commission seems to have its own interpretation of the convention, of the requirements under the convention, and they don't take at all into consideration, for example, the the recommendations they receive from the CRPD committee, you know, through the kind of regular reporting and the review system. There is also this shared management excuse, and the Commission says, and these are some excerpts from our complaints, it is up to the member states to set up the operations within the framework of applicable rules. So, you know, they kind of try to wash their hands. They say, well, and plus we don't have an absolute prohibition of investing into institutions in any case. Finally, I mean, I think one of the biggest limits of this complaint system is how they assess the actual complaints. So what they do is they talk to the managing authorities in the countries concerned, and basically they asked the managing authority if they believe that the, you know, the program that we are complaining about is violating the charter. And of course, I mean, as you can imagine, no managing authority is going to say about their own program, about their own plans, oh yes, that's exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to violate the charter. So in response to our complaints, they always find that there is no violation of the charter. And here are some ridiculous, you know, comments they make. So they say, we have not found any references in the Austrian rural development program. This was a complaint of ours about the use of rural development funds for the building of a children's institution. So they say we have not found any evidence that could be considered a violation of the above mentioned principle of the charter, nor did we find a breach of the provisions of the CRPD, of the Children's Rights Conventions, and so on. So as if, you know, the country is going to set out in the program what, you know, that they're planning to segregate children and so on. And the other one is very similar, that was in relation to Poland, where they again say that, you know, they did not find any references neither in the operational program nor in the documents related to the projects that could be considered amounting to a legal violation of the above mentioned principles of the charter. Of course, these principles that they're talking about is about the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the community and independent living. So this is, I mean, this system, we continue using it, but I mean, the way they assess the complaints is completely meaningless. Also, no national human rights institutions are consulted, no independent reports, no civil society reports. We've had a situation in Austria where they told us that the Austrian Disability Council approved of the project that we are complaining about, only for us to then find out that the Austrian Disability Council actually lodged a complaint about that very same project as well. So go ahead, Luis, to the next slide, please. Now we like to, was the main topic of this presentation, was about the legal case. So it's good to move to that. So after, you know, all of this failed, finally, we have decided to go to court. We have done that in relation to Bulgaria. So we have taken, as I mentioned already, we had a petition to the petitions committee about the deinstitutionalization process in Bulgaria. We have made complaints to the commission, and basically they failed to react. So the next step was the court. So the case was about a call for proposals, which was about what they call the institutionalization of social services for older people and people with disabilities. It was approximately 18 million euro, if only it was 18 euro from ERDF. And it was to be used for the building, renovation, furnishing, and equipment of 6 daycare centers and 68 care homes for older and disabled people over 2 years. And they selected 29 municipalities with 1 to 9 of these places per municipality. And just like Adam was mentioning, I mean, for example, there was one municipality, very small one, population, you know, barely 8,000, which was to host 7 of these care homes for 100 women with disabilities, with 12 women per home. So it was simply about moving people from big institutions into smaller institutions, all of them being, you know, on the same grounds, very close to each other, in the middle of nowhere, in small towns. So it wasn't deinstitutionalization at all. It was simply, I mean, it was reinstitutionalization and just moving people around the country. And there was a clear recommendation from the CRPD committee that, you know, this kind of policy of moving people from large to small institutions was a violation of Article 19. And there was also an explicit recommendation to ensure that EU funds are used to promote the inclusion of persons with disabilities in society. Moreover, I mean, this whole process with adults and older people being moved from large to smaller institutions was just a copy of a process involving children. And there was a finding after that process was completed that there was sort of a lesson where that, you know, the majority of children with disabilities placed in group homes continued to live in isolation. So there was even evidence from a very similar process in the same country that it would most definitely lead to continued segregation and human rights violations against this group. So despite all of that, the Commission refused to take action in relation to this call for proposals. So we luckily found a pro bono company, law company, which assisted us in this process. And I will let Stephen now explain to you how the court case went. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ines, and thank you, and Louise, and all of you. It's a great privilege to join you today. So this first slide of mine looks a little bit like a law professor or something, so I'm going to keep it brief. I should say I'm Stephen Allen, Executive Director of the Validity Foundation first, and we are a specialist international human rights organization that uses legal strategies to advance implementation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. From our perspective, we're based or headquartered in Budapest in Hungary. We have some very, very strong legal tools to try to enhance the accountability for both member states and the European Union itself, in that the EU has also ratified or confirmed the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Just very briefly, what that means is that the EU has voluntarily acceded to international human rights law, and the treaties of the EU, which are actually the highest source of EU law, give direct effect to that international and those binding international legal obligations. And that needs to be reflected at all levels of European Union law and policy making. So we think we've got quite strong legal grounds there. The question is, how do you get this into the courts? If we could go to the next slide, please. The natural route, of course, to challenge discrimination in the use of European Union funds is generally at the national level. National member states hold the authority to control and spend money on a general basis, as long as this is in compliance with EU law. But as we've heard from the Ines and many of you before, in fact, a lot of member states are consistently, and to your point, and/or systematically violating European law and international human rights law in the use of this funding. So the question becomes, even under that of shared management of EU funds, how can we hold the European Commission itself accountable? And the key mechanism that exists, of course, is the Court of Justice of the European Union that sits in Luxembourg. It's got 2 levels to this court, and it has jurisdiction both to interpret and apply EU law. More specifically, it can assess the legality of actions taken by EU institutions. This includes the European Commission as essentially the executive arm of the EU, as well as to assess the legality of actions taken by EU member states when they are implementing EU law. And to be very clear, when you're using EU funds, you're implementing EU law. It has a role in providing authoritative and binding interpretations of EU law. And what we wanted to do is to bridge that gap to which Gerard was referring at the beginning of this webinar. We wanted to get out of that myth domain about protection of non-discrimination and equality. We wanted to see accountability and control of the operational arms of the European Union. If we can go to the next slide. I've mentioned the legal basis, so I won't spend long on this. But beyond the treaties themselves, we do have some very strong standards within the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And it's worth recalling that the Charter has an equal status to the EU treaties, meaning from a legal perspective, it should have the strongest force when it comes to legal adjudication. Articles 1, human dignity, 6, right to liberty and security, and the rest all provide a framework from which, at least from a legal perspective, we can argue that institutionalization does amount to discrimination and violation of treaty provisions. And indeed, this is strengthened even further when we take into account the binding nature of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on all member states of the European Union as parties to that convention, and on the European Union itself as a party to that convention. So let's move to the legal challenge. At this stage, and following our discovery of the call for proposals in Bulgaria and our partners at the Center for Independent Living in Sofia, the European Network Independent Living, us, and CIL in Bulgaria came together to call attention, firstly, to the European Commission that funds were going to be used in direct violation of clear and binding EU and international law standards. We asked the Commission to suspend that funding, and when they refused to do so, we decided to challenge that very decision itself. We argued that the Commission's failure to actually use its powers to stop the money amounted to a violation of European law. Before the Court of Justice of the European Union, we claimed 3 grounds for this. First, we said that the failure of the Commission to act directly violated the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both Articles 19 on the right to independent living in the community and Article 13.1 on access to justice for persons with disabilities. I should say that the Convention itself also explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. Secondly, as we understood, the people who would be affected by this funding call were largely those who are held under Bulgaria's highly abusive system of guardianship. This, in legal effect, prevents them from challenging the decisions about them within the Bulgarian courts. Indeed, we argued before the Court of Justice that if they did not step in here, the people affected would have absolutely no legal option available to them to challenge the misuse of these funds. And thirdly, we argued that these failures combined amounted themselves to violations of EU funds regulations in accordance with the CRPD and the Charter. Now, we knew that this was going to be a hard battle because the Court of Justice has very strict rules over things such as standing and admissibility. But we sought out some of the best legal minds in the world, and you've already heard from one of them this morning, or this afternoon, Gerard Quinn, and another third-party intervener, a professor of European law, Gronia de Burka. Both of those pointed out very, very clearly that the Court of Justice was pretty much the only domain that had the authority to adjudicate in this case, that it should adjudicate in this case, and that the use of funding in this sort of way was in direct contravention of the treaties and EU law. So we had very, very strong support. But let's move ahead. I know Andor's going to tell me to hurry up, so I will. We lost.
I'm trying.
On first instance. I would just add that we lost on first instance. The General Court of the Court of Justice accepted that the Commission's refusal to act was in fact a legally challengeable decision. They accepted that the Commission's decision did have legal effects, but only on Bulgaria as a country, not on individuals who are affected by the money. It said that such agreements to provide funding under EU ESIF funds were actually closed agreements between the European Union on the one hand and the country on the other hand, and declared our action inadmissible. In essence, what you see here is the harsh refusal of the court to look beyond the words in the contract between Brussels and Sofia in this case. And so we decided to appeal. Let's go to the second level. Unfortunately, the Court of Justice itself, which is the higher level of the court, agreed that our action was inadmissible, even though they acknowledged that there were serious human rights questions to be answered here. It was the simple nature of the agreement, as far as they were concerned, that could not be challenged, even though persons with disabilities in Bulgaria themselves would never be able to access justice. Indeed, they argued that the concept of shared competence and the closed nature of this agreement rendered it impossible to be challenged on this case. Now, do I think that if we move to the final slide, and Andrew, I will close in about 1 minute. Do I think this is the end of the game? Well, no. I think what it shows actually is the ineffectiveness of the judicial overview of Commission action so far. What we do know from this is that we have, and the courts are likely to accept, that the CRPD does have a binding effect on the interpretation of EU law. And indeed, that can help strengthen future complaints, national legal actions, and other types of legal actions that we are now preparing. One of these will be preliminary reference procedures, where we force national courts to ask for that authoritative and binding interpretation from the Court of Justice. We can also consider using other international mechanisms, including the optional protocol to the CRPD, which the EU has not yet ratified, but should. Finally, let me just point out one thing. The lawyers of the Commission say that most of our complaints cannot be upheld, and that the Commission itself frequently does not have the power to act when member states use funding to institutionalize people. That is, in our legal opinion, untrue. But the other interesting thing that they also admit is that this poses a huge reputational risk to the European Union. All of us here next year should be making good on that reputational risk by informing the United Nations, who will be reviewing the European Union on its compliance with the CRPD, and I should expect, quite frankly, some very, very powerful findings against the European Union on this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, Inez. It was great. What I would like to highlight to all participants, because I think it's important that everybody understands that you have been working actually on complaints and legal cases since, just help me a little bit, since 2010, 12, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So you have one of the, let's say, longest experience actually how to use legal tools against let's say discrimination in EU funds. So that's why actually your presentation was absolutely great, to show that actually they are legal instruments. As Ines said, actually let's say the results are a little bit limited, but still we are not giving it that up. And without further ado, actually maybe colleagues, they can ask questions actually from you in the discussion part, but maybe we can go to the Fundamental Rights Agency, because we have the great opportunity to listen to the colleagues from the Fundamental Rights Agency, as they might launch, or they will launch, a report about exactly the same topic what we are discussing today, how the human rights legal requirements should be respected in EU funds operations. Robert, if I understand well, this is your presentation, right? The floor is yours.
We are presenting together with my
right.
colleague.
Okay. Yeah.
I will just kick off, and then my colleague.
Yeah, sure. Please share your screen, Martin.
Yes. So welcome everybody, and thank you for.
You also sound very far away, Martin. I don't know whether that's just me.
Okay, let me just try to fix it somehow. Is it better like this?
Yes, much better.
Yeah. So thank you for the invitation, and we are very happy to be here, and I think we have a common cause, and we would like to highlight how we believe the Fundamental Rights Agency could contribute. Basically, it's a new area for us to deal with EU funds, and I will just say a few words what we are doing, and then, as Andor mentioned, a sooner report is coming out that my colleague will describe. But basically, it's very interesting to us that so far, none of you mentioned the national bodies with a human rights remit, the so-called national human rights institutions, the ombuds institutions, equality bodies. But we believe that they could have a very important role to somehow fix what Andor called a systemic problem with EU funds. And when we talk about EU funds, we are investigating all phases, all stages of the funding cycle, from planning, programming, implementation, and monitoring. And we concluded a research, which included desk research, interviews, both European and national level. You can see the countries where we conducted with our FRANET partners the research: Bulgaria, Croatia, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, and Portugal. And we also have a Norway grants funded project where we work closely with NHRIs and we build their capacities. That is in Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Latvia, Poland, and Slovakia. We also work closely with civil society, and that's why we are very happy to be here with you. We also consulted with some of you last December in Brussels. And our report is coming out very soon in December, but we are very happy to share some preliminary results, and this is where I would invite my colleague Robert to step in.
Thanks very much, Martin. It's great to be here with you. I think you can probably show the first slide. So of course, as Martin mentioned, the project looked at the whole cycle. A few basic findings related to key issues when it comes to upholding fundamental rights in the funding cycle, we call it. Of course, it's very important to enhance the range of organizations involved in the monitoring committees. We found that when it comes to the committees that monitor the spending of EU funds at the national level, there were issues in terms of both who was involved, what NGOs were involved, and also the practical functioning of the monitoring committees. So what was it accessible to them? Were they able to really discuss fundamental rights issues? We found that was fairly limited, actually. And of course, one of the key issues in our report is how to involve the independent fundamental rights bodies like NHRIs and equality bodies. And there, of course, it's very important that they are involved throughout the cycle. I think you just heard some examples of the importance of monitoring at the national level. And it's clear that, of course, NGOs can jump into the gap, right, that is there in terms of documentation of violations, but clearly the national bodies could play a role there as well. Martin, maybe the next slide. We also noted that there was often a lack of expertise on the part of the national member state authorities, and indeed on the part of the beneficiaries of EU funds on the charter, a lack of awareness of charter provisions, of CRPD provisions. So clearly, there needs to be some more training and more guidance for the officials that are involved in approving some of these projects. Clearly, in some cases, of course, people have been made aware of these things, right? So that's not the only cause, but clearly the minimum is that people need to be aware of the charter and the CRPD and the basic provisions that prohibit funding of these kinds of violations that you might find. So go back one, I think, Martin. So another
issue, of course, is the importance of cooperation between all the various actors that are involved. So that includes both at the EU level. So that's more kind of in terms of cooperation between, let's say, umbrella NGOs that work at the EU level, work with the at the level of the EU institutions. And I think we're seeing some of that here, which is great. And also at the national level, right? So national level between NGOs, but also between national institutions and civil society. So that's another important thing. Maybe you can go to the next slide now, Martin, thanks. For that, when it comes to the NHRIs and equality bodies, of course, they were given at least an opportunity to be involved in the new cycle. They were already given that opportunity, of course, in the last monitoring side, in the last funding cycle, right? In the 2013-2020 funding cycle was already suggested that equality bodies should play a role. That was made possible by the relevant regulations, but now that's been expanded to all fundamental rights bodies, including NHRIs, and of course the expansion was to the whole charter. So not just equality provisions, but the entire Charter of Fundamental Rights now applies to the entirety of EU funding. So it speaks for itself that it would be useful to have these the NHRIs and other equality bodies working on this. But of course, to do that, they have to have the capacity to work on that issue. They need to be capacitated in terms of having enough people, enough expertise, and enough funding to work on that. And that of course includes the local and the regional level where a lot of this these kinds of things, these kinds of issues occur. So maybe the next one, yeah. Now, what we just heard from Ines, I think, demonstrates the need to have effective complaint mechanisms in place, right? So there needs to be a place to go. There needs to be what one might call a remedy for fundamental rights violations. So that's the case both at the national and at the EU level. And clearly at the national level, it's very important that there is a sort of bridging of the gap between, let's say, fundamental rights and EU funds, those two worlds, let's say. So you have complaint mechanisms that are more of a human rights nature. So that, for example, you could complain to a national human rights institution, but that national human rights institution should know about EU funds, right? It should have expertise in that and be aware of that. And at the same time, you might have the opportunity to complain to a managing authority, or maybe to an anti-fraud body or something when it comes to the, let's say, the more traditional complaints mechanisms at the level of the funds themselves. But those people that deal with those complaints should be aware of fundamental rights. They should apply fundamental rights correctly. Perhaps they should be able to refer matters to national human rights institutions. So I think that's also very important, that the complaint mechanisms need to be effective. Yeah, and then so these are just some general points about how you could do that. I don't want to go into too much detail. You can go back one slide there just to mention that. But essentially, these are the points I was just making, right? To have the relevant human rights expertise to ensure that there is enough scrutiny. So maybe, yeah, go to the next slide, Martin. Yeah. And yeah, we also heard some mention already of this issue, the issue of evaluation. It's very important that from the very beginning of the cycle, that data is collected and in fact is foreseen to be collected on who are the beneficiaries of projects, what might be some issues in terms of violations. So there needs to be very clear, very good data collection that can then be used in evaluations, right? So are the only beneficiaries of the particular fund, for example, Roma children, and is that then, and so as to be able to highlight the issue of segregation, right? So if you collect data from the very beginning of a project correctly, you could relatively easily identify potential discrimination issues, segregation issues that are being funded. So. And again, as I said, it may be useful in some cases to seek advice from the independent national fundamental rights bodies on this. So because they have the expertise, of course, to evaluate such things correctly. And then the next slide, yeah. So so those are some of the things, and these are just some preliminary findings, of course. I just wanted to highlight also that for everyone who is listening here, that our Fundamental Rights Platform annual general meeting, so this is the sort of NGO platform that FRA has, is holding its annual general meeting next week. So you are welcome to join. We will have a session on this topic. We will have a session on EU funds and fundamental rights. And we'd like to see if it's possible to encourage more cooperation between NGOs on this topic. Of course, it shouldn't just be NGOs, but clearly that's a start. So you're welcome to join. And we'd encourage you to join that session and see if we can cooperate further on this. So I think that's about it from our side. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Martin, just go ahead. What did you say?
No, we are looking forward to comments, questions, suggestions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, Martin and Robert. I'm absolutely sure that people, they will have questions to you. I have for sure. But I mean, again, this would be a complete abuse of the situation. But first of all, the speakers, they spoke a lot. So I'd like to open the floor immediately actually to the participants. Please go ahead actually with your questions. And now we can go for a much more flexible type of discussions. Questions from the audience can touch upon, of course, the presentations, but please feel free to ask questions beyond the presentations. I see immediately two hands, like Lazar and Aneta. Lazar, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Lazar Stefanovic. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Vienna, and I'm actually studying deinstitutionalization in European Union as well as in some other countries. And I recently wrote an academic paper on the relationship of the CRPD and the EU law. And I completely agree what Ines and Steven said, but I don't want to repeat that. I just want to give two points very briefly. So what we have seen from the European Commission and also from the ECJ are actually avoidance techniques. So they are avoiding to sort of get in, at hands with this issue, and the ineffective interpretation that was produced by the European Commission or their legal service actually came after the DG Regio issued a communication saying that the investments into institutions is contrary to the CRPD. They issued this to the member states, but then Portugal complained to this, and then DG Regio and DG Employment referred the question to the legal service, which issued a completely meaningless interpretation of the CRPD, very ineffective interpretation of the CRPD, which is definitely not in line with the general rules of treaty interpretation. So in this sense, I would also kind of like to put a light on the bigger picture. That is that there are some power relations in the European Union that might be impeding the European Commission's and other European Union's bodies' willingness to tackle such issues, maybe being afraid of a certain backlash. And European Commission might be more willing to tackle such issues in candidate countries than in member states for the same reason. And another point is that I think we kind of missed to mention, and that is that it is a fact that two interpretive communities do exist in Europe and worldwide. When I say this, I mean communities of scholars, of NGOs, of experts, of persons with disabilities who sort of differently interpret some parts of the CRPD. Some of them are aligned with the CRPD committee. The others are not aligned with the CRPD committee, and they would say that there is still some space for institutions, as also for institutions for children. And this other group might be more aligned with some Convention on the Rights of the Child and the CRC committee's approach to institutions, which seriously evolved in the last 10 to 15 years, but still did not certainly fully grasp the CRPD committee's approach. So it's not only the institutions, it's also the civil society that is divided. And I think it's also kind of an important point in the whole debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lazar. Thank you very much. Aneta, please.
Thank you, Andor. I'm sorry for the light. I just wanted to contribute to the picture in Bulgaria because together with the actions Ines and Steven explained, we tried some another remedies to challenge the EU funding for institutions in Bulgaria. First of all, for those who don't know me, I'm a lawyer with many years experience in this field, mostly in Bulgaria. Now we are a group of lawyers working together with the Validity Foundation. And our primary aim is to challenge the institutionalization of people with disabilities and some other problems related to this. So as part of our strategy several years ago, we tried to start cases against the government authorities challenging the documents for approval of the funding for group homes. We have two cases, one for children and one for adults. Unfortunately, the case related to children finished very, very fast. The court decided that there is no active legitimation. There is not, the children with disabilities cannot be claimant in such a case. They cannot start such a case because of lack of legal interest to do this. And we had application before the European Court of Human Rights, but the European courts decide the same. So it was very unfortunate case. Now we have pending another case exactly for the same 68 group home funded by the government with EU money. This case is still pending. We have court hearing in October. I'm not very optimistic, but still the court in this case decided to proceed, to go ahead, and let's see what happened. Maybe the court decided to do this because we managed to have claimants, persons with disabilities who, one of them had experience with institutionalization, and we have a person who are placed under guardianship, and her guardian decides to jump in the case. So let's see. It's very challenging situation. Yes, we will let you know if we have any success, but this is the situation in Bulgaria for now.
Thank you very much, Aneta. Thank you. I see a hand from Lucas, and if you don't mind, after Lucas, we will go to another field, because I would like to ask Tamás and Justina to present the LGBT field, actually, what do they experienced in Poland. But first, Lucas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have to say shortly that as far as Polish situation in Poland is concerned, there are different motives why people are pro-institutionalization. For example, there is a part of the people with disabilities community who claim that very simply impossible to liquidate institutions in Polish financial conditions. The other part are the academic scholars who are arguing that institution has the other meaning that is described in the CRPD, that the institution has a deep sociological sense, and being against the institutions makes no sense because of that. So there are, for example, many tricky strategies to argue that institution is even that institutions are, even if something not good, but even if they are not good, there are in practice there is in practice no alternative for them, and it will be very useful to have some workshop or brainstorming for introducing such tricky strategy of argumenting to the public opinion, the mass opinion, that institutionalization has alternatives, even in the countries who are not rich, like Greece, like Poland, like Hungary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Thank you. Tamás and Justina, do you mind to join us actually and to share very briefly actually your example? If I understand well, Tamás, you will highlight actually the Hungarian example very briefly, and maybe Justina, you can complete it actually with the Polish. Great. So Tamás, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for giving us the floor to give a short overview about the LGBTQI situation. Many of the things that I will mention are similar to the examples you've mentioned, but there are some specificities. The first one is that unlike for many of the other topics that you mentioned, the LGBTQI concern is simply sidelined in the partnership agreement, operational programs, and the calls. So it's just impossible to apply with any projects that would tackle anti-LGBTQI discrimination because it's not mentioned among the priorities and the target groups. Even though comments have been made as part of the consultation that these should be included, they are not included. The second one is the exclusion of LGBTQI organizations from monitoring committees. This is done in two ways. First, by setting criteria, which is very difficult for LGBTQI organizations to meet. For example, previous experience in monitoring committees or previous experience in consultations. If we are not consulted, if we are not part of monitoring committees before, you are not able to meet those criteria. And even if in cases where you meet the criteria, they just disregard the rules. So there have been cases where my organization was excluded from the monitoring committee of RRF without any legal arguments, and pro-government organization replaced us, not covering LGBTQI topics as well, of course. The priorities often use code words, which are, could be interpreted in an open way, but they usually are interpreted in a very exclusive way, such as promoting family values. And those kinds of funds are very often used by organizations with a very clearly anti-LGBTQI agenda. So they use the money that they receive for, let's say, offering family-friendly services, but actually the staff is working on completely different issues, on collecting anti-LGBTQI signatures, and promoting these content. There is also, in the case of Hungary, a preference and even specific calls that are only open for churches and religious organizations. And of course, that results in sidelining of LGBTQI people, because those organizations are usually exempt from non-discrimination provisions, so they can decide not to offer their services to LGBTQI people. When we approach the Hungarian decision makers about how they will implement non-discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity, they did respond, so they were responsive, but they said, well, there is no question in the application about sexual orientation and gender identity, so no one will know who applies, who has a sexual orientation and gender identity that's different, so it means that there will be no discrimination. So they really don't understand the fact that if there are no LGBTQI related projects, or if the content of the project itself is anti-LGBTQI, they don't consider that as discrimination, only if an LGBTQI person or entrepreneur applies, and then that's discriminated, which of course is not the notion of discrimination that we think. And then specifically when it comes to Erasmus Plus projects, there are cases of very clear discrimination, so projects that applied because the calls there were open enough, but there were informal guidelines distributed among the evaluators that they should point, like they should not include those projects and should point those projects in a negative way. And then they were very creatively using conflict of interest exclusions against the organizations, or when they found no other way to exclude an LGBTQI project, then they simply stated, oh, we will not distribute this money, this round, and we will redirect the funding to another call. So they really use very creatively now ways to make sure that LGBTQI projects and groups would not get funding. Now, that's my short intro to the Hungarian situation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tamás. Justina, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello, everybody.
Thank you for the invitation. I got very inspiring ideas, and I'm really glad it's actually happening. As I joined pretty late, I didn't come with a presentation, and considering the timing, it's 4:15, as we have only 15 minutes left, I would like to point out basically 4 examples of what's the most important problems, challenges, but also some successes that we have in Poland. So having said that, in 2019 in Poland, we started seeing the rise or appearance of so-called LGBT-free zones. Resolutions voted on the local level governments who would discriminate in various different ways against LGBT plus people, but also excluding other groups of the society. And why is this important? Because this is our key area that we tackle, and this is that we tackle in our activities in the EU funds. Luckily for us, in this financial perspective, 2021-2027, the European Commission is putting a lot of effort to underline the importance of non-discrimination in the EU funds. Actually, they managed to introduce a very good mechanism, namely introducing the Charter of Fundamental Rights as an enabling condition to receive EU funds in any project during its preparation, evaluation, monitoring, and so on. So in practice, it means that we manage, due to coordinated advocacy efforts, we managed to introduce on the partnership agreement level and local, national and local programs, provision saying basically no funds for the zones. And this is this worked very well. We have like a huge drop. We note a huge drop of these resolutions in Poland, but still we are facing the situation right now when some of the discriminatory regions, like regions with those resolutions, actually got accepted in the preliminary level to obtain the EU funds. So this is a challenge that we face and that we will have to raise. For example, coming back to what Martin said from Fundamental Rights Organization, we will raise, and we have already actually raised this problem to our national human rights institution. But I will comment on that a little bit later. Another problem that we face is so-called managing authorities and I'm not sure how to call them, but the authorities that are engaged in giving the funds to other beneficiaries. And among these, we have the Ministry of Education, our Minister of Education, so the head of the ministry is a well-known homophobe and transphobe. He has a lot of activities done against our community. And what we do is actually taking preventive actions. And I would be very much interested in hearing, if we have time, if any of you gathered here today are actually doing some preventive actions, because this is what we concentrate our efforts on right now. So we are trying to say to the main minister that actually manages and is responsible for the EU funds in Poland to stop the funding, even temporary, for this Minister of Education, because it violates the human rights, and we risk as a country not to receive the money back not to receive refund from the EU, basically. Another Another and the last example I would like to mention is something that actually Tamas was already saying. We have problems with so-called gongos that are in the monitoring committees in Poland. So no NGOs, pro-government NGOs that violates human rights themselves. And they applied and they did manage to get into monitoring committees on many levels. And the last thing, not a problem, thanks to fundamental rights efforts, we see a growing engagement of our national human rights institutions. So we very much await for sort of report the Ombudsman is doing right now. And I hope that would strengthen the human rights, respect for human rights in the EU funds. And I will stop here as we don't have much time.
Thank you very much, Justina. Thank you very much. And yeah, it's true actually that we managed to talk a little bit later. So, but this is not the last opportunity. As I mentioned it at the beginning, we are trying to continue actually the dialogue from the different perspectives. What I would like to highlight here is that we have seen, let's say, different fields: the Roma rights, disability rights, refugee rights, and now the LGBT rights. But at the same time, we are mostly talking about the ESF and ERDF. But please don't forget, some colleagues, they already mentioned the Resilience and Recovery Fund. And there are some other funding instruments which should be also taken into account. And let me highlight some of them. That Tamas mentioned the Erasmus, which is, again, an important funding instrument where we can see some problems. Let's not forget about the Norway grants. We have already seen, or we have heard already some information actually about the Norway grants, how much actually it's more, let's say, supporting Roma integration, or in opposite, it's going against Roma integration objectives. I don't know, the colleagues are among us actually who are dealing with the Norway grants. And there are some other funding instruments as well. The point is here that we don't want to narrow this discussion actually only to the ESF and ERDF. That's absolutely, but at the same time, we should not forget that this is the biggest chunk of money what member states are using. Right, I see two hands, or let's say, Mila, if I understand well, actually you just raised the question. Mila, do you mind actually, if I very briefly presenting actually the Hungarian case, where we have this success story, as some colleagues, they are calling it, at halfway through success, halfway through. Ah, yes, you're right. I'm so sorry, Louise, you are absolutely right. I completely forgot about the AMIF and the Internal Security Fund. And Chiara from PICUM and ECRA, she's with us. And actually, Chiara, please jump in. Tell us actually what you think on what you have been experiencing actually about the AMIF and Internal Security Fund lately. Okay, Luis, do you mind to share actually these slides about the Hungarian case very briefly, about Nyíregyháza, because I think it would be important actually that you can see, let's say, one example where the European Commission managed to suspend the payments. So the story is the following, and unfortunately the colleague who reported this case to the European Commission, Laszlo Glonci, unfortunately, simply because of stupid technical reasons, and I'm sorry for the language, he was not able to join now, but he will, I think at the later, in the upcoming webinars, actually, he will join us. So the point is here that Laszlo reported a case from a Hungarian city to the European Commission, which was about the Roma settlement rehabilitation. Please go to the next slide. And this city received 4.3 million euros for the so-called Roma settlement rehabilitation. It was around 2017. And even if guidances, or as you mentioned earlier, or regulations or legal requirements are clearly saying that you should tackle housing or spatial segregation, the local authority basically merged two Roma settlements. So as a result, actually, the number of families in a segregated neighborhood has increased, and also the number of students in the segregated school has been significantly increased. So after receiving the complaints, the Commission requested actions. So requested that the local authority will do something, will do, let's say, some corrective actions, so to reduce the number of students in the segregated school, for example, paying for a school bus. But unfortunately, local authority refused to implement this action. And here we have to say that the project had, as I told you, 4.3 million euros, so they had quite substantial amount of money. So the busing the children, compared to this 4.3 million euros, it's basically nothing. But still the municipality refused actually to allocate money for this action, which is clearly showing that there was no political interest to work actually on the desegregation in the city. So after this dialogue between the local authority and the commission decided that this 4.3 million euros should not be reimbursed for Hungary. So basically the local municipality and the Hungarian state basically paying actually for this project. The commission will not reimburse this. The legal basis of this decision was a violation of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which was a very good case for us, because again, we can use this example in other cities or in other countries as the violation of the charter might lead to the suspension of the payments, very simply. Because if you see the commission documents, which we did not discuss today, but there are plenty of commission documents, so-called communications, where the commission said very clearly that the charter, the violation of charter might lead to the suspension of EU funds payments. And I am absolutely sure that the Fundamental Rights Agency report will also highlight this angle. So theoretically, let's say this legal instrument exists. Why it's not more implemented, that's a very good question. But I think we touched upon this question earlier, that policy guidances and other instructions are not implemented, let's say locally, as Florin, for example, mentioned in Romania, that even if the CLLD should eradicate segregation or decrease the segregation, unfortunately, the projects are doing opposite. Luis, can you show us the next slide? Yeah, and you can see just simply on the map that these are basically the two big Roma settlements in this city. And unfortunately, this drawing is not very good. It was my product, sorry for that. But basically, the arrow is showing from the settlements on the right, actually families have been moved to the other settlements on the left. And these settlements became very big, and the school is now a big segregated school, right? Basically, that was it. So let's go back to questions. Mila, I think you were the first, and then afterwards, Chiara.
No, but wouldn't Chiara present first?
Sure, yeah, sure. Chiara, please.
I thought it was a moment for her to present before, yes.
Yeah, sure. Chiara, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. I'm not really presenting, but I can share a couple of insights. From our research. We published at ECRE and PICUM. It's two networks working on the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants. So we mostly look at AMIF, BMVI, ISF funds, but also ESF Plus. And we published a policy note earlier this year. I will put it in the chat box for those who are interested, where we basically look at the implementation of the rules related to the enabling conditions, especially those related to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, where our main argument is basically that there are some mechanisms. I've heard a lot talking about monitoring today, and our argument is there are some mechanisms that should be in place, at least on paper, that the member states should have in order to be able to be eligible for EU funds. So basically, the member states need to show that they can respect fundamental rights to be able to receive funds from the European Commission. And while we were carrying out this research, we also found out something that is quite interesting, which is the fact that 8 national programs, namely the AMIF and BMVI and ISF programs of Poland, Cyprus, and Hungary, they were adopted by the Commission, but they were also they have also been considered not compliant with enabling conditions related to the Charter. So this is information from January. Maybe, I don't know if the Fundamental Rights Agency has more updated information on that, but just to say that as long as they are not compliant, they are not going to receive reimbursement from the European Commission. And this is something that is quite big. If you think about it, can have huge consequences on the way member states comply or not comply with the fundamental rights. Yeah, I will stop here because I'm mindful of time, but thanks for sharing the chat box, Louise.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chiara. Thank you. Thank you. Mila, please.
Probably for next time to consider a whole day, it's extremely interesting, and I think so much more to keep on discussing and thinking in the ways forward. No, I wanted just to ask something regarding the projects or the rejected projects or this called hidden policy on not financing projects on LGBTIQ+. During COVID time, and I will draw some parallel from what we managed to do in Mexico, and also offer to those of you who are interested probably to get in touch with some of the institutions or organizations that managed to do quite some substantive research. Of course, not with EU funding, but just to share ideas about the main themes that were covered. One topic that the government did not want to finance or to address, of course, had to do with trans people. But then when this is addressed, that any topic related to trans people, when it's referred to the right to health and the differential impacts of COVID on the right to health, and then another area of work that was very well developed was housing, then the funding arrived. And then governments were more willing, and I'm speaking governments because we have federal states and then the federation. There was more willingness to invest in topics that go on the verge of social rights. I know that it's not the best thing that we can do, but it's one way to address a topic. So it was the right to health during COVID and the right to housing during COVID, because it demonstrated very specific problematics. Another topic that drew a lot of attention was sexual workers from the LGBTIQ community. And then if you can share just a little bit about what are the major projects that you were considering and that were blocked for funding. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mila. I have a very technical question. Louise, maybe you can help us because we are a little bit running out of the time. So with the captioning, so what we can do? Can we continue? We don't hear you, Louise.
For the captioning, it will depend on the captioners.
Yeah, okay.
On us, and of course other participants. Maybe we can continue, and if the captioning has to stop, we apologize.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
A specific time.
Perfect. All right. Okay. Then just the colleague who is doing the captioning, maybe he or she can tell us actually that's how much we can go further down. We can continue if the participants they would agree. We can continue a little bit of discussions because Mila she raised some questions, and it's more probably for Tamás and Justina, if I understand well. But maybe we can start actually with that. Justina, Tamás, do you have any response to Mila about projects? Basically, if I understand well her question, that maybe is there any project examples?
Where the specific project example with the Erasmus Plus Fund, it was about preparing youth workers on how to help youth if they are rejected by their families. That was one particular project that was rejected for several different reasons in different rounds. But there are multiple projects related to improving healthcare for trans people, HIV/AIDS related care and stigmatization, and just general making health services recognize the specific needs of LGBTQI people and various subgroups of them. And then also there were plans of projects for education, sexuality education projects, which are included as a priority, mental health in schools, to improve those services that would need a very clear LGBTQI aspect to it as well. There were projects which were helping victims of crimes, specifically to include hate crime victims as target groups. So there were multiple suggestions of how LGBTQI concerns could be included in the operational programs and specifically then in calls. But very often this failed at that phase. And of course, there would be no projects if there are no priorities there for which the project could apply to.
Okay. Thank you very much. Justina, do you want to add something?
Yes, although I really have to leave. I'm very sorry. So Mila, maybe we could continue, individually.
Sure.
But
sure.
I wanted to say one thing. We have the very same problem in Poland as Tamas signaled right now in Hungary. But in the previous perspective, we had some situations like some organizations wanted to organize a screening of pro-equality movie related to LGBT. And they were refused, or public institutions like culture institutions, local cultural institutions, or youth public institutions stopped answering. So in the second case, you cannot clearly deduct or prove that it was a discriminatory act, but you can assume that because still the organizations were not mentioning specific screening and specific movie. All was fine. Only when they started to talking about LGBT, there was silence on the other side.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say that indeed we also managed to, due to advocacy efforts, we managed to do exactly what Yumila signaled. So in 2020, we were very much in touch with the European Commission and some of the regions, basically managing authorities who are responsible for division and control and so on of the EU funds, were blocked because they declared themselves as LGBT-free zones. So the EU, EC actually took a very strong stand, and they didn't want to give, I think it was REACT EU fund up then, till the regions actually re-voted or just repealed the resolutions. And I'm really sorry I have to go. I have four examples, but maybe for another
Thank you very
time.
much. Thank you very much. And thank you very much mentioning actually the Commission letter to the Polish authorities about the LGBT-free zones, because this is the second example where the Commission can suspend or can act, let's say, funding and operations because they consider this is a violation of the Charter.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for invitation, and take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Justina. Thank you. If you don't mind, can we just spend 5, maximum 10 more minutes on one question, because that would be important probably to close this discussion today, which was extremely useful. That some of you, Lefteris mentioned and some other colleagues also mentioned, let's say the political atmosphere around these questions, what we are discussing today. And the colleagues from the Fundamental Rights Agency, they highlighted that there are legal instruments. Stephen and Ines, even they mentioned actually that, or they explained what they have been doing, how to use these legal instruments. But at the same time, we see that, let's say, the results or let's say the implications are quite limited. So would it be possible to just to reflect on these questions, what to do? So how to find the balance between this, let's say, not very supportive political atmosphere versus actually the existing legal instruments? Lefteris, do you mind to start?
It's a very
Sorry.
broad question. Yeah.
I'm really very sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, look, when we discuss politics, I mean, one point is to involve politicians in the discussion and what are they doing in everyday institutional life. So putting pressure on members of the parliament, national and European, putting pressure on commissioners, etc., but on the government also. And the other point is the other side of things is how we do politics. Because the notion of politics, as you know, is a bit demonized. I mean, the work that we do is political, but we don't discuss about politics because we think that discussing about politics means supporting a specific party or defending a specific national interest. No, I think that politics is our everyday life. Whatever we say or we don't say, the choices we make or we don't make, the fact that we are here and we work in an NGO and not in a private company. So it is a discussion that we need to make in order to be able to speak in a different way. I mean, liberated by the constraints, the constraints of thinking that we are doing politics and this is not okay. There is no principle of no politica in any case. I mean, there is no neutrality here. When politicians use this type of wording and they take this type of decisions, and we see it in the results all around the elections in the EU, there is no room here for neutrality, because as long as we, give them consideration or we tolerate what they say, they take over the space. So we need to find some type of political answer to that. I know and understand that it's very complicated because in NGOs there are boards that usually are not willing to go over that line. People feel that doing politics is not complying with the role of NGOs, etc. It is a very wide discussion, but it is on us because politicians continue to do what they do. And you saw what happened during the visit of von der Leyen in Lampedusa, how she was exploited. You saw, for example, and this is a very specific example, but it has to do with ethics and deontology. The Greek Prime Minister invited von der Leyen for a private visit in Greece, in his summer house, and she did accept the invitation. And then the two of them went on to discuss about institutional affairs of the EU. Okay, I mean, you need to prove that you're not an elephant at some point. And this is the type of discussion that we are missing, and the way that we approach these issues, and how do we present them? Because it's a nice way to do our work and present the project and do an evaluation and then follow the rules and then give the deliverables and then, I'm totally fine with that. But we are missing some type, if you want, some type of fact-checking approach, because the commissioners and the politicians are okay to say whatever they want. And there is no one countering their narrative because we are afraid that we do politics. Sorry, they do politics. We have to answer in some way. I don't know how. It's not easy to resolve this in 5 minutes, but it is something that we need to think about it very carefully. And you have there a space where this is difficult to resolve. For example, for people who work for the Commission. The people who work for the Commission, you know it, I know it, all of us know it. In some cases, when there is an informal discussion, they say different things. When there is a formal discussion, and yes, they have to be neutral, I get it. They represent the Commission, they come from a member state. So this identity thing is very complicated. I get it. It's not on them, it's on us. So we have to find a way to develop this type of approach and this type of discussion and find clever ways to answer, because we are losing.
Thank you very much, Lefteris. Ines, you raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Andor. And I think Lukasz also has his hand raised. But I just wanted to say, reflect on what, oh, sorry, I forgot her name. The colleague who was talking about the LGBT in Poland. Yeah, Justyna. I mean, it just struck me that, the only way to get the Commission to act is if a country actually, says a zone is kind of a human rights violating zone. So if we can I mean, as long that's so ridiculous. I mean, if you know, with us, they always say, but you know, these institutions are good for the people or whatever. We're trying to do good things. So maybe if we can, you know, if we could get them to establish some kind of human rights free zone, more human rights free zones, we could get the commission to do something. But yeah, it's ridiculous. But I just want, I mean, I agree with the previous comments. I think the NGOs should be more critical as well. I mean, we are just a few here, but in general, you know, everybody's being very nice and glossing over. I mean, they even when they're trying to promote better use of EU funds, they don't want to mention the bad practices because, you know, you don't want to discourage the member states, you don't want to make any, you know, fuss. So, and unfortunately, yeah, I mean, there are good projects, that there are many good uses of funding, but I mean, we are trying to make sure that there is that this money is not used for segregation and for other human rights violations. But I think there's just not enough NGOs willing to get involved in this and be actually critical. So
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, I actually fully also agree with that point from Ines. Unfortunately, what we often see with national partners and even some of our international partners is that they are reliant predominantly or even fully, some cases, on national funding from their governments or indeed from European Commission funding. I'm quite happy to say Validity also receives European Commission funding, but that doesn't prevent us from joining legal actions where we need to. And I would encourage other organizations to think in that sort of way as well. There was a concern, I know, in some when we started our the case with Enil that we may be experiencing direct reprisals from members of the European Commission, but of course that did not happen. And I still believe that there is a level of professionalism that understands the crucial importance of independent civil society monitoring, fierce advocacy, and frankly, that allows us to respond to some of these concerns that many organizations of people with disabilities and others have, that they will lose the limited funding that does actually exist. The final thing I just wanted to say is that I don't think a lot of this, although I know that there are discussions about strengthening monitoring, I actually think there is quite a lot of monitoring that happens, but to kind of quote an often misused phrase, and especially in the disability field, there are none who are so blind as those who refuse to see. And unfortunately, I think one of the biggest political issues we have relates to some of the individual perspectives of quite senior leaders inside the European Commission, whom I view are failing in the exercise of their obligations to monitor and control the funds. That's a question for the European Commission. I do think the Commission needs to be a little bit more serious in its role in defending the European Union treaties, including the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And it's taking into account, actually, we are really running out of time, but I think it was important, actually, that we are a little bit going beyond simply just the project examples. That's important to understand, actually, where we are now and where we are heading. And Robert and Martin, they mentioned in their presentation that actually the role of the equal treatment bodies or fundamental rights bodies is not so much discussed today. Which shows, for me at least, very well that actually their role is not fully discussed. And unfortunately, even actually when you talk to some fundamental rights bodies, you have some limited replies, simply taking into account that they understand the fundamental rights violations, but when it comes to the EU funds, they don't see actually their role, simply taking into account that another bureaucracy, another procedures, which they don't necessarily understand. That's the information what we got actually from several fundamental rights bodies, mostly in Eastern Europe. That's why they are not stepping in, because simply they are not understanding actually the mechanism. They don't see their capacity in the EU fund stuff. So that we would require a lot of job. And that is why we would like to continue this dialogue actually about their role and what should be done, how to capacitate the fundamental rights bodies. And before Hungarian colleagues, they would say that, yeah, but in Hungary, the fundamental rights bodies are killed. I completely understand. And we are going back again into the hostile political atmosphere, obviously. But at the same time, in some other countries, they exist. Let me give you an example, Romania, and Thorin knows very well what I'm talking about. Romania, it exists, but there are no cases actually about the EU funds operations in Romania. There are simply no cases. We asked several times, no, nothing happened in the fundamental rights body. It's called Anti-Discrimination Council, if I remember well. Nothing, no cases actually about the EU funds operations in front of this council, which shows very well that basically this council is not dealing with that. And there are other examples, unfortunately. So we would like to continue this dialogue in that manner. And I really thank you very much actually for joining us today. And I'm really happy actually that we managed to put together colleagues from really different fields, and you could see actually that human rights violations are happening in all fields. So the final words would be that simply just that we should really just unify our efforts and to fight together actually against these things, because otherwise actually we are too much separated, too much isolated, and we are not able to, let's say, reinforce our strength. Thank you very much again for joining us. You will receive the presentations, the captioning, the video, everything will be publicly available, and we are at your disposal actually to respond to any further questions, right? Again, thank you very much. It was great to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.